we've got some of the highest energy prices in the world, despite being one of the lucky enough countries to touch on assets. We're sitting on absolute decades and decades and decades worth of our own energy treasure that we all own. Oil, gas, shale gas, coal, lithium. And yet the eco-zealots believe that we'd be better to leave that locked underground and import energy from overseas. And it's a catastrophically foolish policy. It's wrapped up in these words net zero, and it's making our country poorer. It's making us colder, and cold old people die early. So this policy is not only, in my view, financially negligent, it's actually criminally negligent. People are dying early because of this insane net zero policy. It's again, I use an anecdote. If a long lost auntie, the last thing she does for you, Nick, is she says to you, I'm going to hand down my house. And by the way, there's some treasure under the floorboards of the house equal to the value of the mortgage of the house. I couldn't be bothered to dig it up and use it. Right? I'm pretty sure the first thing you'll do is get a clean screwdriver, carefully lift up the floorboards, take out the treasure, pay off the mortgage, and carefully replace the floorboards with your screwdriver. The analogy is the same with our energy treasure. The value of our energy treasure is equal to the value of the national debt, for heaven's sake. So we could use that. We could have cheap energy. And if we use our own energy, we save CO2 emissions. Importing CO2 from America or the Middle East creates 3 to 4 times more CO2 than using our own gas. It's insanity. And here's the thing. Think about what happens. So when you buy energy from overseas, you buy a bunch of gas, you send them your cash, they send you the energy, you then burn the energy, right? So you've kept warm for a week, great. Then what? Where's your money? Your money's overseas, you've got nothing, you've burnt the asset, and your money's not coming back. So it's catastrophically, economically daft to carry on doing this. We're importing 5 million tonnes of coal from all over the world, South Africa, from Australia. We've got a century's worth of the stuff under our feet to use in our steel industries, and so on and so on. So look, we've got to use our own energy treasure. That'll make us much more competitive. It'll create jobs, it'll keep our money here. Westminster's net zero policy, for the reasons I've just outlined, is net stupid. And the only zero, if we're not very careful indeed, will be the amount of money in our children and grandchildren's bank accounts.
Yeah. And one example that particularly bothered me, being from Cumbria, was the Cumbria coal mine. It's like, because you mentioned steel and coal, it's like we're going to have to import it from China or something. It's actually environmentally worse, and you don't want jobs. And even like Keir Starmer, an alleged Labour Party, doesn't want jobs for northern people. I mean, you could barely make it up. He doesn't want mining jobs for northern workers in the left. It's kind of hilarious. But yeah, I took it personally because they said it was an embarrassment, some people even on Sky News, that we were going to open this coal mine. So it's very frustrating, to say the least. But with net zero then, what do you think the motivation is? Because, you know, there are all kinds of speculations, but is it just they're captured by this climate ideology, or is there something more sinister, or is it stupidity?
If you don't understand something, follow the money. And there is so much money in the green lobby, the eco-zealots. People are making off like absolute bandits. Take the offshore renewable energy industry. They're receiving, renewable energy in general, receiving over 11 billion of annual inflation-linked subsidies. They're making money hand over fist. They're not even fulfilling the contracts they sign with the government. There's another 5 billion of network operating costs. That's over 15 billion. That's 500 quid per annum per household in additional costs that we're paying others. Well over 80% of our renewable industry is owned by overseas investors and hedge funds and sovereign nations. So again, we're sending all this money overseas, and as a result, we've got much, much more expensive energy. So look, it's a combination of virtue signalling, it's a combination of money, and other nations around the world are literally laughing at our naive stupidity. We represent less than 1% of global emissions. We've legally committed to get to net zero by 2050. Only 17 countries or so have legally done that. The likes of China, funny, isn't it, how they've sort of said, yeah, we'd like to make progress towards reducing emissions by 2060. You know what will happen? We'll get to 2051 and we'll have impoverished ourselves. China will have taken lots of our jobs and our money. And then they'll look back and they'll laugh at us and say, well, that didn't work out very well for you guys, did it? So we better not do the same. We'll just have lots of cheap energy and keep being really competitive and taking your jobs and money. Thanks very much. So that's what's going on. And it's utter insanity. There's a reason. Let's remember also that, yes, we all want to reduce harmful emissions, but CO2 is plant food. It literally, without CO2, there's no photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, there's no plants. And without plants, we're all dead. Literally dead. And CO2 levels are relatively close to multi-million year lows. So there's a huge misappreciation. And there was a fascinating video the other day. US senators on a important Senate committee, they were asked by someone, what percentage of CO2 is there in the atmosphere? They had not a clue, even though they were supposedly intelligent, elected representatives talking about climate change. And they guessed at around 5 or 7% of the atmosphere is CO2. The answer is 0.04%. And these people are clueless. Most people are utterly clueless. And so we're the only political party that will stand against net zero, against making people poorer and colder. And do you know what? The vitriol that we receive on this subject is worse than we received on Brexit. Worse. And there's a reason for that. It's because of it's just follow the money. There's so much money involved in this green lobby, and it's a redistribution from poor people to certain vested interests. And we're going to call it out for what it is.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I do a lot of work for the Daily Skeptic, so preaching to the choir on this one, because that's one of our big things is climate skepticism, around the mainstream climate narrative. But if you're on the BBC or something, you're not even allowed to give the other side pretty much, because that's seen as misinformation. So it's a huge challenge actually getting the information out there to counter the narrative.
Don't anybody dare call me a denier. Climate change has always taken place for millions and millions of years, and always will. And I remind people, so what happens when we get to net zero? Let's say the whole world gets to net zero tomorrow. Even the IPCC's own report says the thing that people are most worried about, sea level rise, if you got to net zero tomorrow, it wouldn't have any impact on sea level rise for somewhere between, they do say this with high confidence, which is reassuring, for somewhere between 200 and 1,000 years. I mean, it's just insanity. Would be much better to spend a few million quid on some carefully targeted sea level defences and adapting with a bit of air conditioning and technology and so on, than trying to prevent climate change, when actually there are much greater factors like solar variability, sea level oscillation, volcanic activity that most people have never heard of and don't understand, that have a much greater impact on climate change than greenhouse gases from CO2.